Volvemos a la sesión de la mañana del segundo día de la Conferencia Internacional sobre Plataformas en el Palacio de la Aljafería. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos. Nuestra segunda parte consiste en la presentación de tres speakers, todas ellas relacionadas con nuestro tema de las plataformas y un poco pensando más allá sobre posibles críticas y soluciones. Entonces, tenemos con nosotros ahora mismo al profesor Don Nonini. Él es profesor de antropología en la Universidad de Carolina del Norte, en Chapel Hill. Quiero decir que esta universidad es la más antigua de Estados Unidos, es la universidad pública, además, no son todas privadas en Estados Unidos. Yo lo conocí allí durante mi doctorado en antropología. Entonces, ha sido una suerte volver a encontrarnos y lo podéis leer en muchas revistas de ciencias sociales, pero quiero destacar sus libros, sobre todo este último, del activismo de la comida hoy, esa otra cara, ¿no? Ya que estamos hablando del reparto de comida por grandes plataformas, bueno, pues para deciros que también tenemos esta otra cara del activismo de la comida. Entonces, como dijimos ayer, The Tumultuous Politics of Scale, co-edited with Ida Sasser, en Routledge. También ha escrito sobre class and state formation, cuestiones de clase, como Eduardo, que nos comentaba que trabajáis todos en Argentina sobre la cuestión de clase, pues él lo trabaja en Asia, sobre todo entre los migrantes chinos en Malasia. Y os recomiendo el Companion to Urban Anthropology, que también lo editó con Willie Blackwell. Bueno, pues le damos la bienvenida a Don, que se ha hecho sus kilómetros en aire para venir hasta aquí. Un aplauso grande.
Maribel, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I have some advertising. The book came out 2 days ago. So it's not at your local bookstore yet, but there's hope. Okay, so I'm drawing on it today, and we're going to enter an entirely different world. It's a different world that I want to be absolutely clear about is not devoid or absent of class or race relations at all. I am not David Graeber. No soy David Graeber. Bien, okay, bueno. In this paper, I discuss food activism in the southern United States and its connections to forms of unpaid, or free, if you will, and what I call alternative paid labor. I draw on collaborative ethnographic research at 4 different sites in North Carolina in the United States on food activists, that is, people who work to improve their local food systems, either to make these systems more sustainable environmentally or more socially just by seeking to ensure that all people in the locale have sufficient, fresh, and culturally appropriate food available to them regardless of economic or social costs. In a few rare situations, food activists actually have worked together to simultaneously develop environmentally sustainable and socially just food systems, and these are very interesting in the current political environment of advanced neoliberalism in the United States, austerity, and in particular, an enormously high problem with food hunger. Perhaps 1 out of every 7, 1 out of every 8 people in the United States are food insecure. That is to say, on the edge of hunger or are hungry. So I'm going to give examples, 2 examples of both kinds of food activists today. But I invite you to read the book to find the rest of the story. It was an enormous project, and I'm just giving you a bit of it today. So I want to propose that, oh, by the way, the The ethnographic research took place in 4 different locales in North Carolina. 2 were urban, 2 were rural. It involved a research team, and I worked with the late Professor Dorothy Holland, who played a key role in the making of this book, although I did most of the writing because, unfortunately, she passed away in 2019, in April 2019. The book took another 2 to 3 years of writing and then publication. They take forever. It just seems forever, but it's a long time. And so I propose that an important overlap between my subject today of food activism and the conference theme of platform systems and their effects on workers are the processes of food provisioning, urban food provisioning. This is what brings the 2 topics together. Right, so that large populations of people have to be fed on a continual basis in urban areas where the primary use of land is not agricultural, but for housing, industry, commerce, transport, leisure, etc. Under contemporary neoliberal capitalism, and I'm focused on the United States, so I hope to make a bit of comparative comments. Food provisioning can be done through either or one of 2 fundamentally different systems. You've heard a lot today about one of those systems. That's the dominant corporate industrial food system, because you are talking about convenience foods, also known as fast foods, and those who deliver them. This is the cutting edge of the new dominant corporate food economy, in which it now seeks to incorporate a new phase of value extraction of food delivery. And we've heard so many really interesting and insightful talks about that. So, but you all know broadly what the dominant corporate food system is like, because you all are, or many of you, not all of you, of course, many of you have worked on plantation farming, as we just heard from Irena, or on, of course, the food delivery system. So this is the system that I'm not going to talk about today primarily, although there are, of course, important connections. But I won't talk about those. Hopefully people will ask questions. So what I am going to talk about are local farming and food provisioning systems, small but intensively operated peri-urban and nearby rural farms that engage in direct sales to eaters in periodic urban food markets and to schools and other urban institutions. Small scale, there are small scale bakeries, butchers, dairies, and so forth. But we also find within the local food sector urban self-provisioning micro enterprises like commercial small gardens, or even non-commercial ones as well. Some local farmers are what we would call, the ones I'm particularly interested in that we found are trying to engage in non-fossil-based agriculture using natural, if you will, natural, not industrial fertilizers, using compost locally, et cetera, And so I won't go into that because I can't focus on that today. So I hope to make some brief comparative comments, but I'll try to do that at the end. Suffice it to say that what I'm interested in are looking at the connections between those local farming systems and, if you will, the non-capitalist economy. Just think about that idea, the non-capitalist economy, and let's deconstruct it. Let's talk about it in terms that make more sense. And I found extremely valuable the work of Gibson Graham in their 2006 classic Post-Capitalist Politics. And I'm using some of the concepts from Gibson Graham in my paper today that I want to, forefront, I want to bring up, want to emphasize. Okay, just give me a minute. I'll get to that. Okay. Let's start by some class and racial characteristics of the local food economies as we see them in the U.S., and I'm suggesting perhaps what little I know about local farming systems and food systems in the EU. But you can challenge me on that. Until recently, at least in the U.S. and in Europe, small-scale local farmers with property rights to land have been primarily Euro-descended, i.e., what we broadly identify within racial terms as whites. That are mostly engaged in what the agricultural economist and sociologist Harriet Friedman has called simple commodity production. In other words, this is labor that entails self-exploitation by the owner, cultivator, but also the exploitation of family members, and something that's where I say, I am not David Graeber. He doesn't understand or pay attention to exploiting the exploitation that takes place in these simple commodity production systems. Okay, those owning farms of slightly larger scale will also employ in the U.S. and I suspect in the EU as well, small immigrant farm labor, and those that involves sometimes extremely gross exploitation. Okay, so again, I'm not David Graeber. I think it's worth repeating that, because the idea of this, that somehow I've entered this kingdom of pre-capitalist or non-capitalist innocence, is one that I think we need to dispense with. Okay, then we don't have to pretend that I've simply lost my Marxist marbles. And that's hard to translate. But you get the idea. Okay. The vast majority of the labor effort, as I entails self-exploitation, exploitation of family members, and the vast majority of the eaters are consumers they sell to in farmers markets, and in other kinds of direct sales, tend to be well-to-do and Euro-descended. Although in the U.S., at least, this is beginning to change, and of course, the multi-ethnic background of EU suggests as well. Nonetheless, on the whole, this kind of local simple commodity production of small volumes of fresh and highly desirable produce and artisanal meat, fish, cheese, bread, etc., has become marginal economically. It occupies a small niche in what could be viewed as the luxury food economy or sub-economy for affluent upper class consumers. Okay. Nonetheless, that is not all that's involved. So let's ask some questions briefly from our research and about what the small farming sector looks like, at least in North Carolina. And again, we found these characteristics in the 4 different locales. In the U.S. and in North Carolina, second income sources such as pensions or retirement money, petty inheritances, family members employed outside of agriculture, unpaid and underpaid youths and volunteers are necessary to supplement farmers' or artisans' incomes. In the EU, unlike, I'd say, the U.S., the institutionalization of agricultural subsidies via the Common Agricultural Policy, there's nothing comparable to that in the U.S. In fact, it's anti-Common Agricultural Policy in that it's all the way supported, provides economic subsidies of several $billion per year to large-scale plantation-based, monocropped, industrial, fossil fuel-driven agriculture in corn and soybeans in particular that provide the input into industrialized manufactured foodstuffs, what is called central aisle materials, all the manufactured goodies, the candies, the cereals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's where the subsidies is. So it's unlike the small local farming sector, is totally unlike the EU Common Agricultural Policy, and though I'm sure Spanish farmers, like small farmers, like other European farmers, argue with the Common Agricultural Policies in its details, they must, in a certain sense, love it standing from afar. Of course, it's not true empirically, but there's something to argue over. There's a discussion that is not taking place in the U.S., not hegemonic, not on the agenda. Okay. as I said, this is not only is this local farming sector, not only does it have racial difference, but of course class difference is quite involved as well. And there's a kind of white privilege that we see in these local farming systems. But again, I want to say all that by way of showing you that I'm not idealizing this. Okay, so let's turn to Gibbs and Graham very briefly. And what I want to do is just mention that their analysis says some really important things. Gibbs and Graham provide an inventory of the kinds of labor, transactions, and enterprises that constitute what they are referring to as the diverse community economy, and that illustrate people, individuals, actual social interdependence and economic interdependence. In people's everyday lives, they point out, they expend different kinds of labor, they engage in different kinds of transactions with one another, and they work together in different forms of enterprise to produce needed goods and services, as well as to produce surplus wealth within the economy. They differentiate, Gibbs and Graham differentiate the different kinds of labor and what they produce. They talk, of course, about wage labor in the capitalist wage labor. They write about piecework, like and digitalized piecework, even. So, but they also write about unpaid labor. Of course, as feminist geographers, they refer to women's labor, housework, family care, neighborhood work, volunteering, self-provisioning, even the work of the enslaved and incarcerated. Because of this, Gibbs and Graham are arguing that this is not the standard capitalist-centric model that we envision of the capitalist economy. So they observe, for example, that if you take unpaid housework, volunteer work, and other non-market-oriented labors that sustain households and locales, if all of that is taken into account, as they say, quote, empirical work on the subject has established that in both rich and poor countries, 30 to 50% of economic activity in terms of output is accounted for by unpaid household labor, right? Okay, very significant. Okay, of course. They also refer to different kinds of transactions, some of which are capitalist or market-oriented, direct market-oriented transactions. You want to buy something, you have money, you pay for a commodity, you receive the commodity. Okay. But they also refer to transactions that are what they call non-market transactions, as they put it, that sustain us all. These are transactions of goods and services produced and shared within households, transactions that people take from nature, if you wish, that is to say self-provisioning through fishing and gardening, hunting perhaps, people and organizations that give away goods and services, people who steal things, again, no idealization here, taxes appropriated by the state. These are transactions that are not market transactions, and they are part of our everyday lives. And what Gibbs and Graham are saying again and again is that we have to stop thinking hegemonically about capitalist wage labor, market transactions, and capitalist enterprises based on the exploitation of labor. Okay, and finally, speaking of enterprises, Gibbs and Graham define an enterprise as an economic unit for producing some good or service while simultaneously producing, appropriating, and distributing the surplus labor of others who work within the enterprise, right? But this incorporates, say, cooperatives, a producer's cooperative, for example, that sells with market transactions to the outside, but within it has a different model from the employer-employee model, right? Everybody, if you will, is a laborer. Everybody is a worker, if you will. I know that is idealized, but that's a place to start with. Self-employed, people who are self-employed, household-based enterprises where men appropriate the labor of women. All of these different forms exist along with capitalist enterprises which range from family firms with employed outsiders, as in my Chinese research, what I found in Malaysia, partner-owned capitalist firms, publicly listed corporations, and many more. So it's a diverse economy, and that's the key point. So what I'd like to do to conclude is to first, Carlos, if you put up this diagram here, I'm going to very quickly walk through it because I want to give two examples from different parts of it. I'm going to stand up to do this. I did this all the time when I was lecturing actively. I can project. If you can't hear me, scream in the back. Would it help if I had?
Pero no se puede mover.
I can stay here if you want to do it. Yes. Okay, don't worry. Yeah, sorry? Oh, okay, it's easy. Let's say it's easy. Okay, so if we look at this, this is the table, how the local food system and food activism map onto the diverse community economy. 5 minutos. We can look, if we look vertically, we have transactions, we have kinds of labor, and we have, and then we have enterprises, right? So we're going to start with the capitalist system, if you will, the capitalist market transactions, waged and salary labor. I can make it bigger. Yeah.
Arriba a tu derecha, aquí también los 4 puntos de sur.
Okay, bueno, that's good, much better. Okay. This is what happened when you do an entire project over that lasts 15, well, not that long, but 10, 12 years, and then you come up with a lot of results. So what I'm saying is that we're going to go through this because market transactions under capital, in the capitalist economy, if you wish, are familiar to you. So is waged and salary labor. So are capitalist enterprises. So Carlos, if you can scroll down slowly, let's go to the next group here. A little bit more. Poquito. You can take that. Alternative market hybrid transactions with alternative paid labor and alternative capitalist hybrid enterprises. So you can see some of the different kinds of alternative transactions, some of the different kinds of alternative paid labor and alternative capitalist enterprises, or alternative to capitalist or hybrid enterprises. And the ones in red, I'm going to try to talk about very briefly. Reciprocal exchange of labor based on cultural expectations under alternative transactions, and reciprocal labor exchange with aspiring farmers working for a meal and deferred reciprocated labor. That's crop mob. Okay, Carlos, if you'll scroll down to the next, a little bit. Non-market transactions. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's all right. That's fine. Okay, here are non-market transactions, right? This is, for example, the gift giving of food or garden land through cultural reciprocity and cultural norms, involving unpaid labor, neighborhood work to start gardens, composting with no monetary compensation, compensation by produce and non-monetary means, social approval, and so forth. And there's another example called the Happy Hills Garden. So I want to focus on these alternative forms of labor and transaction for the very brief rest of what's left in my talk. So if you can just take that down, Carlos, so we won't distract from people or distract people too much. Okay, let's talk about the crop mob in Durham, all right? Jay Thomas, a founding member of a group called the Crop Mob, spoke about its ongoing project by young farmers of exchanging labor on different farms in the Research Triangle region of North Carolina. Jay characterized the work of Crop Mob as building, as he called it, the kind of community that would be needed to make sustainable agriculture for the people who practice it, because it's super, super labor-intensive work. So the Crop Mob is a social event where the farmers can get together and socialize while getting stuff done and being productive, because it can be real easy to feel like you're out there all by yourself, toiling away, and like you're not part of a movement when you got to do all of this work by yourself. So how does a Crop Mob work? 3 minutos. Oh, gracias. Before a Crop Mob Sunday, one of its members invites other crop mobbers to show up at their farm to join them in laboring together to prepare the farm's fields for cultivation. For example, removing rocks, tilling, adding compost, while enjoying each other's company. At the end of the day, after the work is done, the host offers a dinner prepared for all of those who have worked together, and the day will end in a celebration of the collective achievement. The genius of Crop Mob lies in members rotating as hosts, and thus each member who wishes would be able to draw on the collective labor of the entire group to open their own field at a future day. And that's, this is sort of, you see this in peasant farming systems in Latin America, in the Andes, for example. So I'm not going to say more about that, except that Jay, it describes its evolution, how it became extremely popular in this region and moved elsewhere within North Carolina and the U.S. South and even to the West Coast. So the crop mobbing became a kind of a movement. It became a social fad more than a movement, but it's the basis for this free contribution of labor. It's not truly free, of course, because it's based upon this reciprocity, right? So Jay notes that a lot of folks involved in the crop mob would be self-described anarchists. That's no surprise. While many, including Jay, were suspicious of what was then in the 2000, a few years earlier, called the nonprofit industrial complex, as they witnessed nonprofits falling apart because their funding was being pulled during the great financial depression of 2007 to 2008, which we have not recovered from yet, on my view. Okay. So let me briefly go into the other example called the Happy Hills, love these words, Happy Hills Community Garden. We found a second example of a site in the local food economy that shows non-capitalist kinds of labor and transactions in the town of Rocky Mount, in an economically depressed coastal region of eastern North Carolina, with an agrarian legacy from the Jim Crow period of racial animosity based upon local white elites owning farmland and controlling finance and, above all, job opportunities, and a very impoverished, highly criminalized and African-American population. So you have a kind of an older Jim Crow-like, but not Jim Crow quite, situation prevailing. So it was under these conditions that our site ethnographer, one of our who worked in this site, called Willie Jamal Wright, described the distinctive Happy Hills Community Garden and its remarkable manager called, and this is not a pseudonym, the late Lawrence Farmer. Okay. Willie said, the Happy Hill Community Garden is located in the Happy Hill community of Rocky Mount. Those who live in the community affectionately refer to the neighborhood as the Hill. Unfortunately, the community is known notably for its crime and poverty rates. After a hurricane that swept through in 1999, Hurricane Floyd, this area, which was appropriated by the city of Rocky Mount, was left vacant, and then eventually the Parks and Recreation Department of the municipality converted it formally into a community garden, but nobody was putting any effort into it, or much less money, until Lawrence Farmer came along. He was a retired Rocky Mount farmer, also a master gardener with extensive gardening experience. He spent thousands of dollars of his own money for supplies, seeds, and other expenses on the garden, but also paid the He said also paid $750 annual fee to the city for access to the garden plot and for water, which is not to be taken for granted. And yet when people from the neighborhood of Happy Hills came up, he refused to collect the $15 user's fee when they sought access to the garden space. When Willie Jamal asked Mr. Farmer why he refused to do this, he said, quote, "I don't rent it, garden plots, that is. I let him have it for free because I rent the garden from the city and I give it to the community." Okay. The fee waiver among the garden made the garden very popular among residents, and I just want to describe what Willie Jamal has to say to conclude this example of a if you will, contributed labor, self-provisioning, right, and a kind of, and transactions based upon social reciprocity. He said, Willie Jamal noted, quote, "Folks wouldn't even ever be speaking to one another if it wasn't for the garden. On any given weekday or weekend, morning or evening, it was not uncommon to see people talking with one another, taking tours of each other's plots, sharing knowledge, stories, seeds, and harvests." Mr. Farmer's fee waiver and his friendly manner were crucial not only to gardeners' participation, but also, and this is the key point I want to make here, to the food and financial security of poor residents in the city. Willie Jamal states, "The importance of this garden to individuals on fixed incomes is profound. From my observations, I learned that many of the gardeners used the food they grew to supplement their food needs and free up funds for other household costs." When Willie Jamal asked Mr. Farmer why he felt the garden was important to residents, Farmer replied, "For one thing," quote, "for one thing, the economy. With the economy we got now, we need all we can get. I think that is, the garden does help them as far as the economy was concerned." And Mr. Farmer was himself reflecting back on this terrible period of unemployment that the global financial crisis entailed for locals in 2007 and 2008, when the local unemployment rate was 14%, or 1 out of every 7 of the able-bodied workers. So I want to stop at that point. There's a lot more I could say, but I want to invite conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And yes, I just look at my watch and it's 1:15. So we need to keep moving, and we are going to welcome Josie Hooker. Josie Hooker is a PhD candidate in Global Political Economy, University of Bath, from the from the UK. Okay. Her interests are in Marxist feminist social reproduction theory, work-related health, labor, welfare, and migration regimes. And Josie has worked on research about social protections for gig workers in Italy, Sweden, and UK. And she's author of several papers on the EU Platform Directive. Okay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Maribel. I'll jump straight in because I know we're short on time and we did the thank yous yesterday. My paper today is based on my PhD research, the title of which is on the screen. It was born of a collaborative action research project with a campaign to improve conditions in the UK commercial cleaning sector. So I want to highlight this is commercial cleaning, not domestic cleaning. Rooted in the campaign's cleaner networks, my project took forward one of the questions posed by the struggles of cleaners and other essential workers during the pandemic. And that is, how do labour, social and border regimes mediate the work-related health of commercial cleaners? And as I said, based on the networks of the campaign that I was working with, I was dealing mainly with Latin American intra-EU migrant cleaners who actually, in vast majority, had arrived from Spain following 2010. and therefore had the majority of them the right to work in the UK as intra-EU migrants, and that's important. I didn't deal so much with undocumented people. So the findings basically are that cleaners face a range of occupational health risks, and these are closely linked to the political economy of commercial cleaning in London. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this part. I covered some of it yesterday. But just to say very briefly, it's a labour-intensive sector with little automisation. It's a highly exploitable workforce that's produced as such. And the majority of cleaning services are outsourced. So that creates some of these problems. And I'm basically proposing we see all of these, or most of these, as occupational health hazards. They create certain occupational health hazards that are borne by the bodies of the workers. So if we look at the occupational health literature on commercial cleaning, these are kind of the main things that crop up. So musculoskeletal injuries, accidents, and more acute injuries, also problems with chemicals. And then the third and the fourth is what we don't see in the occupational health literature, because it's kind of based on like a biomedical model of disease, and it kind of invisibilizes these two problems. One moment. Yeah, so what I want to focus on today is not so much the mechanisms that translate these workplace hazards into occupational health problems, but more the sort of differential ways in which those processes proceed. So I argue that both exposure to workplace risks and protection in case of ill health is experienced differentially, according to race, borders, nationality, gender, class, and disability, amongst others. And especially important mediators here are employment status, which is also a gateway to many social rights and protections, and secondly, immigration controls and status, which in turn is a gateway then to employment and therefore social rights. And just another note here on my kind of the majority of the people that I was working with, as I said before, did enjoy right to work and therefore minimum employment and social protections, but that isn't enough to protect them from these risks to their health. That's my main argument, I suppose. But there's really important work to do with different groups of cleaners. So my argument is that differential protection happens both within the cleaning workforce, and that's the part I haven't looked at so much. So what happens in cases of undocumented workers, for example. I focus more on differences between the cleaning workforce and other sectors of the economy, whether those be generally more privileged workers with better employment protections and compliance with those protections, and on the other hand, less privileged sectors. So I call this differential protection, and I'm going to give some examples of that in national policy and legislation. It also happens via many other mechanisms and processes, for example, formal and informal workplace policies and practices, which, for example, express cultural forms of racism. And I think that sort of links to something that Irene has been pushing today and yesterday. So, for example, the bullying supervisor that, metes out racist abuse as a form of extracting work at an ever greater pace from the worker, okay? So, which would, I suppose, be the parallel to the algorithm. So going to the examples, something strange is happening with the PowerPoint, so ignore that. Okay, so I want to start with national health and safety enforcement by the National Health and Safety Authority. So unsurprisingly, under neoliberalisation, the capacities and activity of the inspectorate, the Health and Safety Inspectorate, it's specific, have been heavily eroded. So starting from New Labour in the 1990s, successive neoliberal governments have sought to minimise kind of top-down health and safety regulation. They've done that by removing duties on employers, marketising health and safety regulation, and creating a model of self-enforcement, whereby sort of self-responsible neoliberal subjects enforce their own health and safety rights by performing correct safety behaviours. So in place of kind of collective struggles over health and safety, which there's a very important history of, sort of collective rights are eroded, and instead individual workers must report injuries, make complaints against non-compliant employers. And of course, people are differentially situated to do that, right? So who has the privilege to be able to wait to take their case to a tribunal? There's many barriers, of course, to that process. So as a result of these policies, there's been a really, really dramatic drop in the number of inspections and prosecutions of employers. And that affects health and safety standards in all workplaces, but it's particularly affected precarised sectors. So over this period, there's been a gradual retreat from proactive inspection of those sectors. And that's justified under a new government strategy of risk-based enforcement, which targets scarce resources towards so-called high-risk sectors, such as heavy industry. And under this policy, many service sectors are labelled low risk. Retail, distribution and warehousing, hotel and catering premises, offices, consumer and leisure industries, but also tellingly, light manufacturing. And that's telling because, like many service sectors, this is a feminised, migrantized and racialised labour market. Now, these policy documents never defined what low risk is. Instead, I say that it's kind of represents like a calculative, post-democratic technique of government that kind of gives technocratic scientific legitimacy to withdrawal of proactive inspection from those workplaces. And I also think it draws strongly from this regime of perceptibility that I mentioned earlier that's been constructed over many, many years. And that privileges the body of the white male industrial worker citizen. So it looks specifically at industrial accidents, and thanks to kind of very hard-fought union battles, some industrial diseases that kind of fit into the biomedical model. So usually problems with hazardous substances and other pathogens. Meanwhile, it excludes and marginalises the occupational health hazards of feminised and later racialised and migrantized industries. These tend to be cumulative and often defy boundaries between physical and mental health. And the example here would be that musculoskeletal injuries that I spoke of earlier have been very much discredited and denied compensation because they're said to be all in the head. So a second example is from national legislation. So health and safety law gives differential rights according to employment status. So here, I don't know exactly how it maps onto the Spanish system, but we have three main categories. We have employees who have full employment and social rights, and health and safety rights. And then on the other hand, we have Limb B workers, which is like an intermediate status that many platform workers probably should fall under, but of course the platforms find ways to not meet the tests. Most are actually self-employed, and they're excluded from most basic employment rights, including health and safety. And in those latter two categories, it's not just platform workers, but other casualised workers. So the self-employed in low-risk activities were exempted from health and safety law in 2015. And LIMBY workers have fewer health and safety rights. Now, this kind of differentiation between the three statuses has been contested a lot in recent years via strategic litigation, brought mainly by platform workers and migrant-led trade unions, grassroots trade unions. And particularly relevant was a High Court ruling in November 2020. As a result of the ruling, LIMBY workers now have unequivocal rights to personal protective equipment, so masks, gloves, etc. And this gave much needed protections during the latter stages of the pandemic, but it's like the absolute minimum, right? And, prevention of long-term health conditions is by no means covered by this. LIMBY workers, as a result of that ruling, now have protection from detriment when they exercise the right to refuse unsafe work, whereas employees have a much stronger right of protection from dismissal. So you can't be dismissed for refusing unsafe work. By the way, you can only refuse unsafe work in extremely exceptional conditions. So it's not a strong right in any case. LIMBY workers continue to lack collective health and safety rights. And that's quite important for what I was mentioning before about sort of collective workplace struggles over health and safety. And of course, those without the right to work are excluded, full stop. The third example I want to give is differential protections in case of occupational ill health. So what happens when you get sick, whether it's something linked directly to work or not, but let's focus on occupational ill health. So there's a range of support available, and I argue that this range represents like a spectrum of entitlement. So we have company sick pay being the most generous in terms of the rate of pay and the payment period, whereas statutory sick pay, which is the government-mandated minimum, is paid by employers, and it's paid way below the minimum wage and only for 7 months. And many low-paid, precariously employed workers, including many cleaners, are not entitled to either of those two. And this slide, I'm not going to go into, but it kind of illustrates the how that corresponds to sort of class, gender, and race. As a result of being excluded from those schemes, people either work through sickness, they turn to savings or debt if they have them, or in medium to longer term cases, and for those with the right to work and therefore the right to welfare, they turn to universal credit, which is the new general benefit that replaces unemployment, housing, and other benefits. Alternatively, they might turn to long-term disability payments. Now, both of those two that I've just mentioned have undergone workfare-type reforms in recent years that basically make payments conditional upon participation in formal employment, or failing that, upon performance of work readiness, work willingness, or work-like subjectivities of self-sufficiency. And in the case of disabled payments for disability, that does, of course, kind of reappropriate some of the demands of disabled people's movements for kind of independence. Now, these conditions as well, and I don't have time to go into it, but these conditions as well work to constrain or facilitate mobility, domestic mobility. So I think this links to something Irene was talking about. I've got a 5-minute warning, okay. Yeah, and there's a long history of sort of welfare working to kind of contain and at once facilitate and stop mobility locally, regionally, but within national borders. Another option is accident or injury compensation. And unlike the others that I've mentioned, this is supposedly universal, but in reality, there are very many barriers for disadvantaged workers, the same ones that I kind of mentioned earlier with employment tribunals. And those barriers are particularly high for people who have health conditions that are marginalised in this regime of perceptibility. So especially problematic is the need to link the health condition to a single employer, where in sectors with extremely high labour turnover and you've got a cumulative condition, you can't do that. One example from my research, a woman named Dalila, who had like really terrible back injuries, sustained in many, many different manual jobs in Spain and the UK. Right, so a compensation system, a welfare system is bordered nationally, right? Whereas workers' bodies are not. So those are just some examples. I now want to talk briefly about the consequences of differential protection, structurally speaking. And I think it boils down to the costs of health, which I think of as health being like a key dimension of the reproduction of labour power, and the costs of maintaining the health of the worker are displaced from employers and the state onto workers, and that is borne by the body of the worker, right? And in this analysis, I'm drawing from social reproduction theory, which has a long history, as we were reminded yesterday. So in the recent, I just want to talk about some kind of precedents for, I'm using the term depletion, differential depletion, as being the result of differential protection. And I just want to talk about some sort of existing usages of the term depletion, and not so much differentiation. I'm kind of putting the two things together. So in the recent non-Marxist literature on social reproduction, one moment, I've lost my spot. Rye and colleagues, as per the reference here, Rye and colleagues identify a very similar process of kind of displacement of the work of reproduction from the welfare state to unpaid labour in households, in communities, etc. And so this is, privatisation, marketisation, etc. of the welfare state. And they say that process depletes the resources and the capacities of individuals and households and communities. It depletes their resources. And one of those resources is health. So health isn't the main focus, but it's an important indicator of what they call depletion by social reproduction. So this literature identifies the differentiated dimension of depletion insofar as it's concerned with the feminisation of unpaid care work. But I seek to extend and deepen the analysis of depletion in two ways. So firstly, by putting it into dialogue with analyses of racialized and migrantized differentiation and depletion. I don't know if that's for me. Okay, I'm nearly there. So in particular, the social reproduction literature on racial capitalism and necropolitics. The references are here. So this work speaks strongly to notions of racialized depletion, even if it doesn't always use those terms. So this work draws from long traditions of scholarship that underline the overexposure of Black and brown people through capitalism's history to especially depleting forms and processes of work, to exclusion and marginalization from the social rights conferred by good work, and to forms of necropolitical governance. Here again, health isn't the primary focus, but it is discussed in terms of like the intergenerational harms linked to white supremacy and coloniality. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, for example, defines racism as a structural overexposure of people of colour to premature death, which I think is really pertinent. Yeah. So secondly, I seek to extend the concept of depletion by focusing more squarely on the sphere of paid work. So this other work is looking at depletion by social reproduction, by unpaid care work. And I'm kind of saying, okay, what's happening in the labour sphere? Obviously, they're completely connected. And unfortunately, in my research, I can't do enough on the kind of social reproduction side. But anyway, in this, I'm following the work of Alessandra Mazzadri, Hannah Schling, and Melissa Wright, amongst many others, I'm sure, who describe the depletion of labouring bodies in feminised, racialised and migrantized centres of global production. So garment manufacturing in India and electronics manufacturing in export processing zones in China, Chechnya and Mexico. So yeah, putting all that together, I'm sort of proposing differential depletion. And just one final remark is that I think it's really connected to questions of disposability and those debates around surplus and refusal, like as Irene was mentioning. And I haven't done that part of the thesis yet, but I've got some ideas. I'd love to discuss them. But I think that I don't think I'm reinventing the wheel by saying depletion instead of disposability. I think they're really closely related, but they're different. And I think, honing in on that relationship between the two seems to be quite interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Josie. Y ya llegamos al final de estas presentaciones de la mañana de hoy. Sí que os quiero animar a todos a eso. Que sepáis que tenemos aquí dos técnicos sacando buenos vídeos para que luego podamos compartir todos estos contenidos. Como sabéis, el Ministerio pone mucho énfasis en la transparencia y transferencia de las investigaciones. Entonces, va a salir todo, aunque no ha podido ser, por motivos de presupuesto, hacerlo streaming en tiempo real, pero no pasa nada. Está archivado y va a estar. Pero fotos así, de esas que se pasan rápido y que por medios sociales o a los medios de comunicación queremos sacar, pues os animo, si luego os queréis sacar fotos y demás, pues ánimo, ¿vale? Venga, pues entonces, mientras buscas el PowerPoint, te presento al último speaker de la mañana de hoy. A ver. ¿Tienes tu cartelito? Sebastian Cobarrubias, de To Us With Bees, con dos Bs, por motivos de movilidades internacionales, las Bs y las Vs se van cambiando. Al final ha terminado con dos Bs. Entonces, there is always confusion with his last name. He's a researcher, professor, not professor, he's a researcher. Research professor at ARAID, the Aragon Research and Development Foundation, in the Geography Department of Zaragoza University. En castellano, ARAID, ¿vale? Como sabéis, a nivel nacional tenemos instituciones como ICREA en Cataluña, Iberbasc en el País Vasco. La paralela sería ARAID. Y en Aragón no lo conocemos tanto, pero que sepáis que existe esta institución dedicada exclusivamente a la investigación y que además es una fuente de entrada al mercado laboral universitario en España, ¿vale? Hace contrataciones y es una manera de venir a España a través de estas instituciones regionales. Bueno, Sebastian is a PhD in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has been steadily contributing to the fieldwork of migration and border studies, publishing in journals such as Political Geography, Antipode, or Geopolitics. He is currently investigating the citizenship regime in Spain as a case of racial preference. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Feels like we're in kind of petit comité here, so kind of intimate. So I'd like to thank, first, of course, the PI. Full disclosure, we form part of a family unit, so I guess that's sort of known. And also for the other people in the project who directly or vicariously, I feel like I've learned so much about platforms over the past couple of years. What I'm going to talk about today is not explicitly about platforms, but I think we're going to find many intersections. And I think a lot of the literature we've been looking at has cross-fertilized or contaminated, however you want to call it, pollinated perhaps. So as Maribel mentioned, I'm a geographer, and I think I'm the only geographer in the room, which is, I hope, adds something to the perspective. I will be showing a bunch of maps just to fulfill the stereotype. What I'd like to do, thanks again also to the translators and everyone else involved with the conference prep. Slower, I will try to slow down. Most of my work over the past decade or a bit more has been on this phenomenon called border externalization, as the title of the talk today is called. Right. So what is that? I'll use a bit of a caricature to explain. If we typically imagine border control, migration control, in popular imagery or in media, perhaps even in political debates, we might conjure up quick images in our head of checkpoints, passport controls, fences, debates about walls, perhaps patrols, flimsy boats crossing a body of water, etc. Right, and that is sort of where the politics and the debate around borders seems to be. Right, and in the case of border externalization, what we're talking about is something that happens very far from those sites, although always in reference, imaginatively, to them. Right, so border externalization is about the idea of the work of doing borders, or the work of managing human flows, human mobility, how it is displaced from particular countries or by certain countries to regions or countries that are territorially far away from them, right? So when country A tries to control its borders in country B or C or D, right? This is the idea of border externalization writ large. So with externalization, let's see if the slide it's doing some sort of funky things here. Okay, it's giving me that nice sort of falling slide. Well, all right. We're referring to something that is legally extraterritorial, right? Where a state is usually a state or an agency or company contracted by a state is carrying out some sort of action beyond its jurisdiction. Right, it occurs in a territory, but legally it's not in its territory. Right, and so it's with border externalization. There's a lot of debate about whether there's agreement diplomatically to do it, whether it's an illegal type of thing. What I think we've seen over the past years is that it tends to be fuzzy, and I would call it illegal rather than legal or illegal. Right, so in this case, a state was trying to manage migration towards itself, but in another country, right? And you can do this through two basic means, right? One is outsourcing, the typical sort of outsourcing we might imagine where you request, perhaps in exchange for a development program, perhaps in exchange for a beneficial trade agreement, that this other country will carry out your migration policy priorities on its own terrain, right? Delegating, let's say, border work to another country. And the other is intervention, right? Negotiating the possibility for this country's, it could be development agencies, it could be border guard units, it could be police units to intervene directly in that territory with the goal not of derailing that country's migration policy, but of carrying out its own kind of border policy, right? So in the case of border externalization, we are before kind of an attempt to manage human mobility way before it gets to any kind of official entry point. And if you think about it, then it's basically a preventive logic. You are trying to guess who the migrants are before they migrate. So in other words, you have to kind of stereotypize, you have to kind of create a profile of who is a candidate for migration, right? That I think will come back to bite us as we move on. Almost, yes. Okay. What can this look like? What can border externalization projects look like? It can be development, it can be visa policies, it can be things like the export of national ID chips, cars with biometric technology. It can be paramilitary operations. So it's a broad gamut of things that fall under these kind of policy framework, right? But what I'll try to show is a few graphic slides coming up that exemplify the spatial thinking behind externalization and how the border is spatially imagined. I want to stress a kind of caveat that these are the imaginaries of border institutions. They do not necessarily reflect migrant itineraries, nor do they reflect the interests of the states where these operations are carried out, right? And it's the spatial imaginary of those who wish to externalize, let's say, okay? So this first couple of slides, excuse me, this is a map called the IMAP by the ICMPD, International Center for Migration Policy Development, which was contracted by the European Commission for several years to produce a map of what they call routes, right? And this was to support and develop and then support a strategy where you would trace migratory routes in order to develop forums of cooperation between different countries along a particular route, right? The idea was then the border needed to happen not at the limit of a state, but along the route, right? So the idea is that the route would consist of, let's say, nodes. Sometimes the language is called hubs and sub-hubs of mobility. And so then borders would need to happen there. Borders could be dissuasion campaigns, advertising why illegal immigration is such a dangerous thing, or saying stay in your own country, or it could be a police checkpoint. It varied what it would look like. But the idea was that the border was the itinerary itself, right? Again, always in reference to that imaginary of that limit that we have in our heads. Okay. Just to give an idea, these images are from 2003. And the years will keep them in mind. Okay. Now I'm going to show slides from, just to kind of bring it to the Spanish case, of the gendarme body, the Guardia Civil, and particularly their border guard service, Servicio Fiscal y de Fronteras, a project that was based on the route strategy, although they argue that they came up with it first, but this is everyone battling. This is something called the Seahorse Project, right? And what they are doing here is this idea of, well, we will kind of trace those routes and we will police the itineraries along the coasts of Western Africa, right? So here it's basically a communications system between police forces in Senegal, Mauritania, Cape Verde, vertically integrated it into a communication system with one node in Madrid and the other one in the Canary Islands. This node is very popular. It comes out in the news a lot now. If those of you who read Spanish media, it is referred to as the CCRC. It has 20 years in operation and is considered pioneer in the European Union. All right. These are more slides. These are publicly available. They're not on the Civil Guard website, but they're not like, filtered slides. If you Google enough around, you will find them. These show the kinds of means deployed during the Seahorse operation. So you will see naval vessels, drones, satellites, patrol vessels, and it's all to find small wooden boats. It's kind of an overkill operation in some ways. The last one is a map of binational patrols. You will see a naval vessel or a Coast Guard vessel, each one with two flags, which referred to the armed agents from the respective countries that were operating with their registered arms on the same vessel. This is diplomatically very complicated to negotiate. So this shows that the numbers of, let's say, police isn't large, but the amount of, let's say, geopolitical or diplomatic nitpicking, bickering, agreeing, coercing, whatever it is quite extensive, especially if you keep in mind this operation started in 2006 and it's still going on. So this is a medium term, let's say, if not semi-permanent way of carrying out policing duties on the coasts of Western Africa. In particular, the ones with the strongest presence are Mauritania and Senegal here. Okay. By note, Frontex, right? Since Spain is part of the European Union, Frontex, which is the European Coastal and Border Guard Service, can officially kind of piggyback on any agreement negotiated by a member state. So some of Frontex's longest running operations are not in the Mediterranean. They are on the coast of Western Africa, right? These operations are now over, to my knowledge, but just so you know, that this includes like a lot of other countries then putting in their forces into this stuff. Someone, your time, you mean then, right? Okay. All right. Now, Since these operations were considered a success in police terms, as in the number of boats that were detained or people that were removed from their migratory itineraries, the idea was that the operations would be followed up. And a series of operations under the name West Sahel Project, referring to the Sahel region of Africa, was to progress inland. So the countries in red, now moving away from the coast, are the new countries that were supposed to be participating in these border cooperation projects. Right, so just kind of keep in mind this idea that that border, where it's happening, is kind of moving along. You're following the hubs, so to speak. Okay. In this case, Mali and Niger are really the main countries in these projects, as opposed to Senegal and Mauritania. Okay. All right. Now, hurrying up. All right. In the academic literature, externalization has been referred to, there's almost like a little mini field of studies now, but it's often been referred to as a series of spatial metaphors, right? This is a big deal in geography, right? It could be things like stretching, mobile borders, remote control borders, international government of borders, fuzzy borders. Then you have some citations there if you'd like on the board, right? The idea is that we are before something new and kind of innovative, even if we're critical of it. And we have to kind of name it and participate in coining terms for it. And I've participated in that myself. EU authorities also saw this as something new. We never thought of doing the border this way, right? And that somehow this process was intimately linked to EU construction, right? To Europeanization, to EU enlargement, to development of what was called neighborhood policy for a time, European neighborhood policy. And the idea that then somehow it was, again, kind of European regional construction as the sort of this vanguard of the future, and this globalization of borders was part and parcel of it for all in all its glory and in all its gore. These interpretations, as you might guess from my tone, are very presentist. They're not inaccurate, but they sort of ignore that anything else had happened before, right? There was no conception of these practices as having a longer history. So this was very concerning to us, especially in recent years. As our years researching this went on, it was like, well, even the term externalization itself is very problematic, right? It implies that there is a clear inside and a clear outside, a clearly delimited state with its fence or its passport controls, and that those borders were fixed, and externalization was a response to the overwhelming of that fixed border. But the more we dug in, the more we realized that many of the countries of which we're speaking as participating in externalization have never simply been nation states, right? They were often imperial states before they became what we conceive of as a modern nation. Right? And this includes many of the members of the EU that we're discussing. So what we now call immigration, only a few decades ago, in some cases, was considered intra-imperial movement. This was also regulated, but it was regulated differently as the movement of subjects within an empire, from colony to metropole, right? And within that imperial structure, that mobility had different rights, limitations. It was regulated differently, right? So what we call, if we always look for the word migration, we won't get back very far. If we read against the archive, we're going to see a very long history. So then what we see is that the extraterritorial action of states has been rather the norm, and not necessarily a recent exception, right? The differential rights to human circulation during the imperial era were a specific way to incorporate distinct territories and their populations into an imperial structure, into an economy, including its nascent notions of nation, that would come later, and race, right? So studies of externalization that emphasize the newness would miss the historical connections, that what is now external was once intra-imperial. Okay, so what we think is that by tracing, or at least signaling some of these histories, not as a continuum, but signaling some of these histories, we may be more attuned to what the role of migration policy is today, right? Here I put, again, we've mentioned quite a few times already over the past 2 days, Yamoulié Boutang's work was very key in helping us to think some of this. I'm not going to get into more detail here, but the idea that he would understood a lot of contemporary migration policy as the result of a long struggle over the abolition of slavery, right? That you have the abolition of slavery, then you have the emergence of the coolie trade, indentured servitudes of different kinds, right? And that what we consider migration policy is interacting with that and is developing way into the beginning of the 20th century, right? It's not something that just the slave trade was abolished and then we kind of forgot about it as some sort of residue of a former economic system, right? Yikes, okay. Monja, in her study of the indentured servitude, also looks at the development of what we call contract in origin, or what we would later end up calling work visas, as a result also of how post-slavery migration among British colonies was managed. And you remember when we were saying among British colonies, we're talking about South Asia to Africa to the Caribbean to the metropole in the United Kingdom. So this was global migratory patterns that were all considered within the empire, all of British subjects. Right, so there's a monk that helps also open up that geographical idea. And the last one here of this historical understanding is the work by Aristide Zolberg, who coined the idea of remote control and writes about the origin of the visa, right? Many of us apply to a visa and we think it's a normal thing to apply at an embassy for a visa. But he traces the origin of this, right? Rather than applying at a port of entry to gain access to a country, to apply in your embassy was a way for the United States in the beginning of the 20th century to filter and create certain categories of which countries would be granted a priori more visas or have a larger bucket of visas. And that way you could kind of design the future ethnic and racial profile of the nation. The assumption being that the visa would be for a permanent settlement. Right, we're talking about early 20th century, so that the visa has its origin in designing what your future nation would look like ethno-racially. We can debate whether that's still the case today. But it's interesting that when we think about this history, this idea, this was the first study of externalization, was explicitly linked to differentiating groups of people, what kind of rights they would have according to ethno-racial criteria, right? Okay, so it's very much easier to think what are the connections between externalization, differential rights, and race when we look at something like Zolberg. I go back just to end that historical section. This is the West Africa Squadron of the Royal Navy from the 1830s, I believe, deployed to suppress the slave trade that had been abolished within the British Empire, patrolling the very same coasts that the Civil Guard is patrolling today. Ironically, in order to fully suppress the slave trade, it was debated that they needed to move from the waters to coastal deployments. And from coastal deployments, they needed to move inland, right? So I see that a similar movement seems to be happening also today. I don't want to say it's the same thing. I don't want to make a simplistic argument that this is neocolonialism redux 2.0, but it's interesting that the same logic, today we call them smugglers and traffickers, then it was called negreros or slave traders, is used to justify an increasing geopolitical intervention based on judging who is allowed to move and who is not allowed to move, right? That if you're moving, clearly someone is moving you, you're being forcefully moved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So back to the Spanish case. Why am I making all these historical connections, right? That management of intra-imperial mobility was key to the development of national identity, citizenship, and the idea of differential rights, and key to the construction of racial identity as being legally significant, right? It becomes legally significant there. We can debate whether it's still legally significant or only symbolically, or whether race has been collapsed into national identity and passports. But that intermingling happens in that period, right? So that somehow these are the ancestors of migration policy today. In the case of Spain, we see, or this is what I'm kind of trying to work on now. I think there are sort of three basic regimes going on, if you will. And I'm going to kind of big imagining now. On the one hand, you have European space, right? That is creating a space of mobility for itself, imperfect perhaps, but there. All the green countries are those that can access without visas. And then these are the kind of the controls that don't control you so much anymore within Schengen space, right? On the other hand, you have that externalization, right? You have that map from 2003, and then all the things beneath are 2022, 2023. These are the recent deployments of Civil Guard aircraft, new cooperation with the gendarmes of Mauritania, etc. And each time you get a deployment, you get a new badge on your uniform if you're a cool trooper. One with camels, Arabic letters and Spanish letters, right? It's kind of like the cultural sort of icons that are also part of these deployments, as they were of colonial deployments. So, an imperfect space of movement, a space of illegalization that happens before you get to the territory. And in the case of Spain, something sort of unique that links to those post-colonial relations, right? You have those two prior ones sit with a sort of post-colonial notion of citizenship inside the Código Civil, the civil code, right? Where to obtain Spanish nationality by virtue of residence, usually you need 10 years of legal residence. This applies also to EU citizens, but given the free space of circulation and residency, it's not really a practical. You don't need to become a Spanish citizen if you're an Italian citizen residing in Spain. There's other limitations of certain professional qualifications and perhaps degrees, but not of the ability to reside. So it mostly applies to extra-communitarians, but not to all, right? And that's where we have this sort of map and this notion of hispanidad. The majority of Latin American countries, the Philippines and Equatorial Guinea, require only 2 years of legal residence. You have a fast track to Spanish citizenship, which I think is what facilitated the intra-EU migration of those cleaners, right? But not all former Spanish colonies get them, right? And writers and others. Moroccan citizens, so the former citizens of the Spanish Protectorate, Sidi Ifni, Southwestern Sahara, do not get access to this. Why? Because in the law it says only those former territories that have a cultural connection to Spain. Now you try to justify what a cultural connection is in court. Well, it's fascinating to follow the legal cases because then what is culture? Right? And that's clearly, is it linguistic? That could be an argument. Is it religious? It could be an argument. Is it cultural or architectural? Right? And all of this comes out in the legal cases when someone from the wrong country applies for that citizenship via the fast track. Right? So with all of this, what I see is a kind of a trifurcated regime, right? Other than sort of like the local born, right? You have an EU space, a space of legalization, and then a space of kind of more included, right, with linked to kind of notions of Hispanicness. What are the long-term effects of that? Policies that favor free circulation for some, those designated as European, an unequal citizenship regime which favors some post-imperial connections, and an emphasis on control, which often coincides with people of a certain phenotype and certain religion. Okay, and I'll try to, anyway, well, I had some stuff on like racial profiling data, but what I'll try to do is a last wrap up here, because I'm over time, excuse me, to link it to platform labor. I think what we're seeing with, I don't work on platform labor per se, but what I think we can say, I make reference back to this idea by Bridget Anderson, where she notes this kind of irony. You have, on the one hand, migration is increasingly regulated, more types of visas, more types of border mechanisms, more types of police guards, bigger forces, right? And labor seems to be less regulated, or it's re-regulated, and there's less health and safety inspections, less inspections of the workplace, et cetera, right? And that these contradictory or opposite directions are coinciding to produce a single result, right? That platform labor, which escapes normal definitions of employment, also facilitates the entry of those who don't have access to those national labor markets. But at the same time, though the presence of those people that can get access to that flexibilized or non-employment employment or self-employed, non-employed, whatever we're calling it, their presence is highly regulated, either by the threat of losing their status or losing the right paper, or perhaps eventually with the threat of removal or deportability, right? And so that perhaps to understand platform labor, we need to look at sectors like we've discussed earlier, agricultural labor, meatpacking, domestic service, right? They might not be as cool and high tech as these Bay Area startups, but they have a lot to tell us into how these unequal migratory regimes segue so nicely with these unequal labor regimes. I'll close there for a timing's sake. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, it's 2:00 and our translators need to go rest. So in Spain it's lunchtime. La hora de comer es sagrada en España y empieza a las 2. Así que cerramos aquí y nos vemos para el documental y la tertulia esta tarde, así como para el paseo por el Palacio de la Aljafería. Gracias. Chicos, me han dicho que van a desmantelar todas las mesas. El que se quiera sacar fotos aquí, que lo hagan ya. ¿Fotos o vídeos? Fotos. Pero,